I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind and in the midst of tears. These are the opening words of a poem after which the sermon is named, a poem called The Hound of Heaven. It was written in 1890 by an English man named Francis Thompson. And Thompson was confessing about his life as much as he was writing poetry. He was talking about a time in his life that was very painful for him, a time of religious anguish, because Thompson was a drug addict. He had become addicted to opium, and it ruined his life. He grew up with just about every privilege you could have at that point. He had a strong Christian family. His father was a doctor. His father even set him up to have everything he needed to have a successful career himself. But he couldn't do it. It was, for whatever reason, he got involved with turning to opium to console him. And then he failed out of medical school. He alienated himself from his friends and allegiances, and eventually found himself living homeless on the streets of London, but unwilling to reach out to the people who could help him. And he describes this time in his life as a kind of running away or fleeing from God, because he sensed that God was always calling him back, but he wasn't able or willing to listen to that call. And if there is a single figure in the Bible who resonates with this experience, it's the prophet Jonah, whose story we are beginning this morning. Now, you've heard the story twice already, so that's good. We're getting very accustomed to it, and I'm guessing that you've probably heard it previous times if you grew up in church. It's one of the most well-known children's stories. But I want you to kind of try to set that aside for a moment and imagine that you are not familiar with this book. Let's imagine that you are reading through the Bible for the first time and you come to this later section of the Older Testament called the Minor Prophets. Now, if you've been attending Shalom, you know that we just finished studying one of the other minor prophets, the prophet Amos, who in many ways is the standard bearer of the prophets. He kind of blazed the trail for what it meant to be a prophet. A prophet was somebody who received a word from God. Oftentimes, it was a word that was difficult and painful for people to hear, but he spoke it to the people in power no matter what the personal consequences. That was the job of a prophet as modeled by Amos. And this actually becomes kind of a pattern. If you're reading your way through the minor prophets, say you get to the next book, the book of Joel, this even kind of begins to take a repetitive form, right? The book of Joel starts like this. The word of the Lord came to Joel, son of Pethuel, and the word of the Lord came is kind of the way of indicating that this person received a vision or message or something from God. And then you get a little kind of a summary statement of it, right? Hear this, O elders. Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Well, here Joel gives kind of a summary of what he's going to be exploring throughout his entire book. This idea that there is a great and terrible day of the Lord that's coming. So you make it through Joel, and then you read the single chapter book of Obadiah, and you come to the book of Jonah. And honestly, your eyes are probably starting to glaze over at this point because let's be honest, this is not the easiest part of the Bible to read through. And it's very similar. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai." And you'll notice this is the exact same form that we have, right? The word of the Lord comes to the prophet. And then you get kind of the core message saying, "Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." This again is familiar territory. You're hearing God speak about the wickedness of a city and how this message needs to be delivered to them. But then you get this. But Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And I imagine you would have to stop and read that twice because it is so different from any of the other writings of the prophets. Uh, First of all, I didn't even know that a prophet could do this. He just says no, like he's not going to do it. It's a rejection of God's call. And in some other cases, we do have stories of people wrestling with God's call. You know, you think about Moses and the conversation with God and the burning bush. He's saying, "Well, God, I don't know about this," and they're kind of going back and forth. Jonah doesn't even open it up to debate. He just goes. And like Herb said, Tarshish is in the opposite direction from Nineveh. Nineveh was to the east, Tarshish was to the west of Israel, and so he is running away at full speed. And it's a bizarre thing because it makes you wonder what kind of book this is, what kind of person Jonah is. He's introduced as a prophet in the very first line, which suggests that he's a good guy. He's one of the biblical heroes. But the very first thing that he does is he disobeys God, which is a bad thing to do. So you might think, well, is he a false prophet? Has he rejected Yahweh? Is he no longer a believer? But as we keep reading, as he's talking with the people that he's sailing with, he says, "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven." Note, not "I used to worship" or "I am haunted by," but rather, "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Apparently, he hadn't given up his faith. He still very much believed in this God and even worshiped this God. But you do have to wonder how a person can really engage in worship when they are actively fleeing from God's presence, which is the phrase that is used multiple times in this chapter, that Jonah flees from the presence of God. It's a very strange book, and yet at the same time, for many of us, it is very familiar. Because I think that this names exactly where some of us are, or at least have been at points in our lives. Maybe there is a way in which we are running from God. Maybe there's a sense that God is calling us to a certain mission or to uh, confront something or someone that's difficult or to get more involved and make commitments and open ourselves up to others. Or maybe God is calling us away from a certain action or a certain way and saying, "Turn, please, don't do this." And we just say, "You know what? No, no, I'm sorry. Maybe later, maybe another time, but this is just something I can't do." And it doesn't mean that we have rejected our faith. We may very much believe in God. We may be practicing Christians in other ways. We come to church, we worship. But you do have to wonder how far that faith can go when it seems that we are just actively saying no. or actively fleeing the presence of God. There's also a kind of bizarreness to this story, and the thought that Jonah thinks he could actually get away, right? Like, what does that even mean to flee the presence of God? How do you think that you can outrun God? Again, go back to this quote, and he says, I worship the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. So it's not that he just has this view that God is in one place and he thinks he can literally get away from him. He knows that God is everywhere. And yet he seems to think that if he's on the run, he can at least prolong it as long as possible. And again, it's one of these strange things about the book of Jonah that is at the same time so relatable. Are there things in our life that we are trying to run away from, even though we know that it's not going to end well? You know, it could be procrastinating something that is eventually going to come to a head. It could be finances that are building up in a troubling way. It could be a web of lies that's about to come crashing down. Who knows what it is, but we know that we can't run away from it, and yet we run anyway. And this is where the Bible says, look, sooner or later, we are going to uh, face the consequences of our actions, right? As this passage in Galatians says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for you reap whatever you sow. Now, it doesn't always look that way on the surface. It looks like some people get away with doing bad things and living comfortably. But the Bible assures us that sooner or later, in this life or the next, we are going to have to deal with the consequences of our actions. As it's put in the book of Numbers, you can be sure that your sin will find you out. And thus we have this experience, this sense that we are fleeing, that we are on the run, and it is miserable. It's just miserable to be in a constant state of running away. But if we're being honest, when we're reading through the book of Jonah, it's not just the natural consequences of his actions that are catching up to him, right? I'm not sure how saying no to maybe somebody else can imaginatively put this together, but how saying no to a mission would somehow cause a great storm, for example. And if we read the text, it's clear that this is not just some vague force of karma, but actually God who is the one who is chasing Jonah, right? It says, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. God was clearly the one who caused this storm to come after Jonah. And it doesn't stop there. It's not just that God starts the storm and then steps back. God is involved when the sailors cast lots to see, okay, well, who's responsible for this, and the lot points to Jonah. God is involved even afterwards in, as the text says, making the sea more and more tempestuous. There's this sense that the storm is growing stronger and stronger with each passing minute, and that God is behind it. It emphasizes this sense that God is relentless in his pursuit of Jonah. And that is the inspiration for the name of this poem, The Hound of Heaven. The Hound of Heaven is actually the way that Thompson refers to God. We don't normally think in these terms of God being like a hound, but he's using a metaphor of hunting. And if you've been hunting with a dog, a hound will catch a sniff of an animal and will be relentless in chasing it. If it spots the animal across the river, it's just going to dart right through the river, right? If it's going under some brush, it paying no attention to how its own body is getting scratched up or beat up. It's not going to give up as soon as it loses sight and gets bored. It's going to sniff it out until it gets back on the trail. And this was how Thompson viewed God at this point in his life, as a kind of hound that he was trying to get away from, right? So he says, "To all swift things for swiftness did I sue, clung to the whistling mane of every wind." So he's there speaking about how he is trying to escape with all the speed and swiftness that he can. But then it switches to this refrain, which is repeated several times in the poem, which refers to God as the hound behind him. Still with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, came on the following feet, and a voice above their beat, "Naught shelters thee who wilt not shelter me." In other words, you can't find shelter from God or avoid God in anything in creation because God is above all of it. And it's a haunting kind of picture. It's not one that feels good, but again, it's one that's honest. Because even those of us who have grown up being told that God is love and who believe that, when we find ourselves in this posture of running away, the way that we think of God is as a kind of threatening presence that we're trying to avoid. It might be the kind of sting of conscience that won't leave us alone, that makes us just feel bad about ourselves. It might be even that we sense in the people and church and circumstances in our lives that we are being pushed in a direction that we don't necessarily want to be pushed. And it's hard to relate to God when you're in this kind of state. But in Thompson's life, he finally did stop running. He couldn't do it anymore. He was helpless. He had to receive help when somebody came to it. He was kind of at the end of his rope. And in his mind, this is the moment when the hound of heaven catches up to him. And he has a beautiful way of describing this kind of interaction that he has with the hound of heaven when it finally catches him. And it was a little bit cloaked in so much old English that you lose the point. So I hope you don't mind. I just updated it. These are more Brian's translations of the words. So you can go read the original later. But so we don't lose the feel of it. It ends something like this. "Strange, pitiful, futile thing," God says when he finally catches up. "Why should anyone set love apart for you? Human love has to be earned. How have you earned of this dirt pile of human love even the smallest speck of dirt? All that I took from you, I only took not for your harms, but that you might seek love in my arms." Thompson finds that this haunting presence that was chasing him was not just the karma of his sins and the consequences of it catching up to him. It was something that was running even faster than that. It was the unconditional love of God. God just wanted to offer him hope and peace and forgiveness and rest. And he couldn't see it at the time. He was so afraid of losing certain things in his life that he was clinging on to. But when God finally caught him, he realized that all of it even the guilt, even some of the pain was a gift from the God who loved him so much that he chased him down like a hound. Now, in our story in Jonah, by the end of chapter 1 at least, Jonah has not arrived at this point yet. Jonah is still on the run, and God still seems like a kind of threatening character. But you can see, if you look closely, even in the language, that there is actually care and love behind this threat. There's this funny way that the last verse of chapter 1 ends, where it says, "The Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah." Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't typically think of being swallowed by an animal as the mercy or providence of God. That's probably not how I would describe it in my life. But that is, in fact, what it was. As Herb mentioned in the children's story this morning, it slowed Jonah down enough that he couldn't keep running. And in that place, in that uncomfortable space, that is where he could finally hear the love of God catch up to him. And so I, for one, am grateful. I'm grateful even when I am on the run, that it's not just my sin or the consequences of it that's chasing me, but that there is a God who is even faster and even more determined, who loves each of us with the ferocity of a hound, if only we will open ourselves up to being caught.